Good afternoon, everybody. This is Green Sunday, October 8th, and today we're going to hear about the U.S. left's purity fetish and why it must be overcome. Our speaker is Carlos Garrido. He's a philosophy teacher at the Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He's director of Midwestern Marxist Institute for Marx Theory and Political Analysis, and the author of various books, including The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, and Marxism and the Dialectical Materialist Worldview. I became acquainted with Carlos because I saw that he was giving a talk at another Berkeley group, and I was able to catch his that talk on recording. And after listening to not only his presentation but the discussion afterwards, I went out and bought his book and read it, and contacted him to invite him to this. I'm going to just read a little bit of the introduction. In The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, Carlos provides a comprehensive development of his concept of the purity fetish, tracing the outlook to the school of ancient Greek philosophy and showing how it appeared in the 20th century Western Marxism and in contemporary U.S. socialism. I'm going to break there and just say the purity fetish is something I think I notice in all leftist organizations that I've been involved in, and has the same problems that he describes in the Marxist groups. In every form purity fetish takes in Western Marxism politics, Garrido argues that one finds not only the failure to obtain truth, but also the inability to create revolutionary movement. Garrido asserts that today the critique and overcoming of the purity fetish is an indispensable task to the fight for the development of subjective conditions for revolution.
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here talking with you all. I have my presentation basically divided in three. First, I want to say some general thoughts about the first parts of the book, what I'm trying to do, because it's a deeply political book where I'm participating in a social critique of the left in the U.S. specifically, which is of course, the context that I'm in, and the context that I draw experience from for the theoretical analysis in the book. But I had a lot of comrades that were shocked when they opened the book and they see that the first chapter is basically going back to a debate that took place 500 years before Christ. So I want to say a few things perhaps about those first couple chapters that are more philosophical in character, why it is that I placed them that way, and sort of the importance of the enterprise of drawing back on where these ideological mistakes and forms of engagement with the world that we're criticizing today, what are they rooted in? You know, where do they arise? How do they develop and change? And how do they take different forms in different societies and different modes of life? And how has it taken a form in this tradition of anti-communist Marxism that has been prevalent in the West, that at least in the realm of philosophy, it's called Western Marxism. And it includes anything from the Frankfurt School to various socialist trends that stayed with the Second International, to things like French theory and other some Marxist humanist trends. And while I think that there's some stuff in Western Marxism that's redeemable and helpful and plays a progressive role, I'm criticizing the negative part. And so the first part of my talk, I'll be examining some of those first parts of the book, but the core of it is going to be dealing with the section of the book that has to do with the U.S., where I make the argument that we have at present what's been called in the Marxist tradition objectively revolutionary conditions. I explain empirically why that is so, and I argue that the reason why we haven't been able to do anything substantial in terms of any revolutionary advance in the country and any substantive and meaningful struggle for socialism is in large part, because of this thing I call the purity fetish. Um, so why start a a book that's a critique of the contemporary American left 500 years before the birth of Christ, with the debates between these two schools of philosophy? And I use school very loosely because these weren't like schools in the way that we think of it now. But you have on the one side the Eleatics, led by a few figures, most importantly, the figure of Parmenides and his student Zeno. Um, and they postulated, in essence, that that being is one, that this oneness of being does not accept change, that any consideration of change is participating in um, the way of opinion, as Parmenides called it. So it's an outlook that rejects the notion of change, rejects the notion of contradiction. It sees contradiction as participating in the route of falsity. And while it has a notion of the one, which is a way that philosophy, which is going to be formulated later on in the history of philosophy as a question of totality, it's a totality, a one that does not allow for internal plurality. And while Parmenides and the Eleatic thought does not get explicitly accepted, I make the argument that throughout the history of philosophy, how we have come to think about the question of truth and the question of universals has in many ways retained the kernels of the outlook of those Eleatic thinkers, which means that truth has always been something which we think about disconnected from change. This, if we examine something specific, the way we approach the truth of the thing is by disconnecting it from its context. Consider in many areas how scientific studies are done, where you literally take sometimes a thing away from the habitat, the environment that allows it to be the sort of thing it is. And um, not that there isn't a place for those sorts of studies, but um, when that systematizes itself into a worldview and how we approach the world in general, I think there's quite a number of central flaws that prevent us from understanding a world that is in constant motion, where everything is interconnected to everything else. Um, and where contradictions are ever present, where things and processes contain opposing forces within them. They contain plurality. They're not these homogeneous entities or homogeneous processes that are just the way they are and never change. This other outlook of seeing the ever presence of change, seeing the only thing that's constant as change, was championed by Heraclitus, who also held that part of the soul that's driving this change, this incessant change, is the fact that there's these internal forces, internal contradictory forces that propel the movement of things and of various processes. And um, these are two different schools. And the argument that I make, the reason why I start here, is in part because whether it's in the philosophy of Plato, how he treats the realm of the idea, the realm of forms, or in the philosophy of Aristotle, how he's thinking about essences and the influence that this has in scholastic thought, and whether it's medieval thought and Christian thought, early Christian thought, which is largely rooted in Platonic philosophy, or later Christian thought, which thanks to Thomas Aquinas gets rerouted in Aristotle and then again goes back to Plato with Luther. What we find is that the the historical context behind all of, or the vast majority of Western philosophy, uh, the way we have come to think about truth is a continuation of this Parmenidean Eleatic framework that focuses again on things as they exist statically. It removes it from their natural movement and thinks of them statically. It thinks of them disconnected from everything else. There's a concept that arises later on in the 20th century in Marxist tradition, reification, divorces things from the natural context that they exist in. And it's unable to tarry or engage with contradictions. It's these contradictions as falsities. Um, I think that part of the importance of tracing it back, excuse me, tracing it back to ancient Greek philosophy is because my analysis is in many ways developing upon uh, the analysis of other Marxist philosophers like Domenico Lasordo, who passed some years ago, and Roland Bohr, and they trace a lot of the flaws of Western Marxism to Christianity, and I found that a lot of the stuff that they trace back to Christianity was only in Christianity because of the influence that uh, Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, has on Christianity. So that's another reason why I situate this ideological phenomenon, this way of thinking about the question of truth in ancient Greece. Um, One of the chapters, specifically the second chapter, I take a deep dive into the history of various Western Marxist thinkers, folks like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and some others, contemporary ones like Slavoj Žižek. And I show how the purity fetish is at play in these thinkers that claim to be associated with the Marxist tradition. Many of them, have honestly written great books on G.W.F. Hegel, which is the philosopher out of whom Marxism inherits its dialectical worldview. But when it comes to thinking about the world itself, and specifically the question of socialist states, they always hark back to this Parmenidean form of engaging with the world, and they were never able to see socialism as a process. They expected the socialist revolutions that occurred, whether it was the Bolshevik or the Chinese or the Korean or the Cuban or the Vietnamese. They always expected these revolutions to somehow imitate the pure idea of what socialism is in their head. They were unable to see how, these projects were not disconnected from the world that they came about in, that they had to construct socialism in a world that was governed still by global capitalism, and where they had to suffer tremendous pressures and hybrid warfare from literally the whole Western imperialist world. I mean, if you think about the Bolshevik Revolution, shortly, some years after, just a couple years after, they're getting invaded by 17 countries, and then a decade and a half after, they're getting invaded by Hitlerite forces. Um, so that's always been the context of socialism, of socialist construction, and we see it today very clearly with Cuba. It's been under a internationally condemned illegal blockade for more than 60 years now, and the sanctions have definitely had a massive effect, but it hasn't just been sanctions. It's been attempts on Fidel's life. It's been, forms of biochemical warfare like the African swine fever that they attacked Cuba with in, I believe, the late 70s. Um, Ideological forms of warfare, channeling billions of American taxpayer dollars into um, groups that try to overthrow the Cuban government, some of which are in Miami, some of which are in Cuba itself. They've been influencing, specifically in the last decade and a half, the hip hop scene. So that pressure that we see U.S. imperialism exerting on Cuba, it's been universal with every other socialist experiment. So when the Western Marxists expect to see a socialism appear out of almost like this void perfectly how it exists in the idea of socialism in their head, it's completely anti-Marxist because Marxism prioritizes reality, prioritizes the real world. It realizes that the construction of socialism, especially early on, is always going to be marked by what Marx called the birthmarks of capitalism that is going to influence not just the economic sphere, but the political sphere, the judicial, ideological, every sphere of socialist life. Um, so the failure then in Western Marxism has always been one that's rooted in an inability to see the dialectics of socialism, how socialism develops in process, how it's interconnected to a global economy that is still dominated by capitalist imperialism, and how it's going to have, just like everything else in nature, human thought, and society, its own contradictions that are going to have to be dealt with. And the fact that there's contradictions doesn't mean that they're not actually socialism, which is a frequent phrase we get from Western Marxists. So when you see and you bring all together what this tradition of Western Marxism um, shares in the attacks of socialism, it's the purity fetish. Their engagement with actual socialist states has never been one that has been done on the basis of the Marxist outlook of a materialist dialectic. It's always been one based on this idealist purity fetish outlook that expects reality to somehow measure up to the pure ideas of what they think socialism is in their head. Um, but that's basically the background for this part of the chapter that I will be reading today, which is the section that's dedicated to the US. Before this fourth chapter, I do have a chapter on China because I think it's obvious that the US's new Cold War against China is extremely dangerous. And a lot of the reactions I've seen from the left have been very disappointing and in line with the purity fetish outlook, which is part of what I think is central to the book and the value of it. That whereas before, maybe we can call out these political mistakes individually and tackle them on an individual nominal basis. Um, when you sit back and reflect theoretically on how are all of these connected, and you realize that they share a foundation in the purity fetish outlook, you can understand the phenomenon of mistakes in the political left in the US and socialists and communists a whole lot better. You see how it's all connected to the purity fetish, and or most of it is connected to the purity fetish, and how it's really just the purity fetish taking different forms in accordance with the political starting points of a lot of these people. So when I talk about the US, we're going to be criticizing various tendencies, some forms that the purity fetish takes in social democrats and democratic socialists, some forms that it takes in communists and anarchists and what's called in the Marxist tradition the ultra left. But without further ado, I'll start the reading. Um, the United States tells the world and its citizenry that it is the best country on the planet, a place where freedom and democracy reign and where an American dream exists, which affords all the opportunity to live flourishing middle class lives with white picket fence homes and 2 automobiles. However, for the working masses of the United States, as the great comedian and social critic George Carlin noted, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. When awake, what the American masses experience is the American nightmare, lives plagued by stagnant wages, inflation, and various forms of crippling debt. In the era of an empire in decline, the inhabitants of the belly of the beast find their conditions more and more unbearable. What the American working class is experiencing is an era of comprehensive crisis which has infiltrated every sphere of the capitalist mode of life. There are a plethora of factors which, when analyzed comprehensively, can point to the existence of objectively revolutionary conditions in the US. Since the late 1970s, as the Economic Policy Institute reports, wages for the bottom 70% of earners have been essentially stagnant, and between 2009 and 2013, real wages for the entire bottom 90% of the wage distribution fell. In no state of the U.S. is the federal minimum wage $7.25 an hour enough to survive, even if it is raised to $15 an hour, as the Democratic Socialists and other progressives have called for. The minimum wage will still not be enough for a working class family to survive anywhere in the country. With stagnant wages and inflation at a 40-year high, almost 60% of Americans are currently living paycheck to paycheck. Many of these people are on the brinks of joining the 600,000 homeless people wandering around in a country with more than 17 million empty homes. It is not surprising in a country where there are 33 times more empty homes than homeless people that 34 million people, including 1 in 8 children, experience hunger, while 30 to 40% of the US's food supply, that is 40 million tons of food, is wasted every year. As it becomes more difficult for working class Americans to survive, more and more have been forced to turn to borrowing. Currently, the average American has around $53,000 worth of debt across mortgage loans, home equity lines of credit, auto loans, credit card debt, student loan debt, and other debts. Additionally, because the US is the only developed country in the world without universal healthcare, the commodification of medicine has left more than half of Americans with such crippling medical debt that many have been prevented from buying a house or saving for retirement. This same for-profit healthcare system found it unprofitable to take the measures necessary to properly prepare for the COVID pandemic, the result of which has been that the US while being only 4% of the global population, accounted for more than 16% of the COVID deaths. Meanwhile, socialist China has had only a very tiny fraction of the deaths found in the US, to be specific, 0.49%, and has 4 times as many people. As the US's post-World War II rise to the dominant imperialist force in the world afforded it, although the US's post-World War II rise to the dominant imperialist force in the world afforded it the means to plunder its way into becoming the richest country on the planet, what one finds today is a decrepit empire with crumbling infrastructure, consistently rated in the D range. While more than half of federal spending goes to sustaining the world's most expensive military, spending more than the next 10 countries combined, many cities in the US, inhabited by millions of Americans, lack access to clean drinking water. Additionally, the US has been experiencing a historic decline in life expectancy, so much so that today the average Cuban, despite 6 decades of illegal blockade and hybrid warfare against their socialist project, lives around 3 years more than the average American. The hardships faced by the American people are intensified by the experience of living in one of the most economically unequal societies in human history, where even by conservative numbers, the top 0.1% hold roughly the same share of wealth as our bottom 90%. In the US, the richest 59 Americans own more wealth than the poorest half of the population. That's 165 million people combined. While the majority of working class Americans face difficulties in meeting their everyday needs, the richest monopolists in the country, those who own what we watch, buy, and eat, have been getting richer than ever before. However, the crisis most Americans are facing is not limited to their economic conditions. It is instead a comprehensive crisis which has rippled into all spheres of life, expressing itself through profound psychological and social ills. These can be seen in the millions affected by the opioid epidemic, in the rise of violent crime rates and school shootings, and in the mental health crisis, where nearly a third of American adults are struggling with depression and anxiety. For more than a decade, study from capitalist institutions have themselves confirmed what Marxists have known since the middle of the 19th century, namely, that the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole capitalist class. The US, which spreads its blood-soaked hands around the world, plundering in the name of democracy, has been outed as a place where the demos, common people, do anything but rule, kratos. As Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page show in a recent study that was published by Cambridge University Press, in the US, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes. When a majority of citizens disagree with economic elites or with organized interest, they generally lose. Moreover, because of the strong status quo bias built into the US political system, even when fairly large majority of Americans favor policy change, they generally do not get it. So far from being the beacon of democracy it fancies itself to be, what the US has is a democracy for an insignificant minority, a democracy for the rich, which is the essence of capitalist liberal democracy. Or in other words, what the US actually has is an oligarchy, as Mexican President Lopez Obrador recently commented. However, the American people, burdened by the conditions of moribund imperialism, have been catching up to the lies that pundits and ideologues disseminate to sustain capitalist hegemony. The US has some of the lowest voter turnout rates in the developed world. Around 40% of the population eligible to vote does not participate in presidential elections. And in local elections, this number increases to around 73%. More than 60% of Americans are dissatisfied with the two-party system and are ready for third-party alternatives. And only around 20% approve of what Congress does. Naturally, it is difficult to participate in a political process in which one does not feel represented. Our two imperialist parties have reacted to this immense public dissatisfaction by cracking down on voting rights and on the ability for third parties to be on the ballot, something I know the Green Party knows well. In addition to this, only 11% of Americans trust the media, 90% of which has been consolidated under the control of 6 companies. Considering the aforementioned state of the American people, it is not surprising that despite countless resources dedicated to propagandize them against socialism, more than 40% of adults have a favorable view of socialism, and amongst millennials, polls show 70% would vote for a socialist candidate. If we refer back to Lenin's pamphlet on the collapse of the Second International, he asks, what generally are the symptoms of a revolutionary situation? And his response is the following three major symptoms. He says, first, when it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule without any change, when there is a crisis in one form or another amongst the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class leading to a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary for the upper classes to be unable to live in the old way. The second factor is when the suffering and want of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. And the third one, when, as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses, who uncomplainingly allow themselves to be wrought in peacetime, but in turbulent times are drawn by both the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. Without these objective changes, which are independent of the will not only of individual groups and parties, but also of individual classes, a revolution as a general rule is impossible. So these conditions constitute the objective factors one can generally find in social revolutions. In essence, as Lenin would later note in his very famous pamphlet that I would definitely recommend everyone to check out, Left-Wing Communism, revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis affecting both the exploited and the exploiters. We have in this assessment above shown how the American masses are suffering more than usual, and additionally, how poll after poll has shown that they are unwilling to continue to live in the old way. For example, the immense disapproval of Congress and of the two-party system. These conditions are developing into what Gramsci called a crisis of authority, namely, the moment of a crisis when the ruling class has lost its consensus and is no longer leading, but only dominant. As he famously argued, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. However, the masses' dissatisfaction and their inability to live in the old way does not exhaust, as Lenin noted, other conditions for an objectively revolutionary situation. First, the masses must not only be dissatisfied with the idea of continuing to live in the old way, they must also show that they are willing to act. And secondly, the ruling class must itself be shaken by the crisis and in a position where they too cannot continue to rule in the old way. Do we see any of this in the US today? Well, the willingness of the dissatisfied masses to act can be seen in a variety of places, from the 2020 summer uprisings, where 25 to 35 million Americans protested the racist police state following the murder of George Floyd, to the 2021 Striketober wave, where hundreds of thousands of workers went on strike, to the mass unionization efforts coming from workers in Starbucks, Amazon, which is the second largest employer in the US, and other industries, to the current crisis in the railroads, where the self-proclaimed most pro-worker president, Biden, uh, forced upon rail workers a contract they voted against, leading unions like Rail Workers United to call for the nationalization of the railroad, amongst other radical demands. And as of the last couple of months, we've seen, of course, the Teamsters vote overwhelmingly in the high 90% to strike against UPS if need be, which allowed them to receive a contract that some have described as a historic victory. And as of right now, we of course see UAW striking at the pressure points of capital, one of the few productive industries that we have left in the country, with their stand-up strike, which again was overwhelmingly supported by its members. Um, However, all of these have been, to a greater or lesser extent, spontaneous movements, which have largely been unable to rise to revolutionary conscience and organization. They haven't been able to take a political form yet. They represent, nonetheless, the prime matter with which a revolutionary organization may form a successful mass struggle for power. Have any of these conditions, however, shaken the American ruling class? Do they find themselves unable to rule in the old way? Our response should be a resolute yes. The American empire, with its 900 bases around the world, used to be able to overthrow governments outside of its imperial sphere of influence with relative ease. In the international community, especially after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Socialist Bloc. It achieved unparalleled global hegemony, only opposed in the 1990s by Cuba and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. All things in this world, however, are in a constant state of flux, and sooner or later it was expected that the end of history would itself end, and that US/NATO imperialist unipolarity would be challenged. It is our era of flowering multipolarity which marks the fall of the American empire, and with it, the ability of its rulers to rule in the old way. From failed coup attempts in if the U.S. state, an instrument of American transnational and finance capital, is unable to internationally govern in the ways that it used to, that is, if it is unable to continue the expropriation and superexploitation of the peoples of the world, this is not simply a foreign policy crisis, but a crisis in the integral state. From failed coup attempts in Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries, to failed summits of the Americas, to the rise of BRICS Plus, to failed proxy wars against Russia and China, it becomes an undeniable fact that the ruling class cannot continue to rule in the old way, that the age of American imperialist unipolarity is over. As the world continues to turn towards China for win-win relations and international trade, as La Patria Grande continues its leftward turn and its hemispheric unity against the US's Monroe Doctrine-style engagement with the region, as movements towards de-dollarization occur across the planet, where the dollar is expected to drop to just 30% of global trade by 2030, which would be a brutal blow to a dollar hegemony that has been crucial for our era of imperialism that's so heavily reliant on sanctions and global financial institutions. As further, European citizens continue to protest the deterioration of their material conditions by the US and NATO's proxy war against Russia, which is completely destroying the German economy, which has been the heart of the EU and the euro, the only thing really backing the euro. It's a powerhouse finding itself spiraling into deindustrialization because so much of their industry relied on the cheap Russian oil they no longer have direct access to after the US blew up the Nord Stream pipeline in human history's worst case of environmental and economic terrorism. As all of these factors continue to accumulate, this crisis in the ruling class would show itself to be more pronounced. Additionally, what greater depiction of the crisis of legitimacy than the fact that both parties over the last two presidential elections have committed themselves to challenging the election results? First, with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, a victory which was garnered while losing the popular vote, the Democrats spent the next 4 years pushing the narrative that Trump colluded with Russia and even attempted to impeach him twice over this. This, along with a long-standing history of anti-Soviet and anti-Russia propaganda, set the ideological grounds, especially amongst previously anti-war liberals, for the Russia hysteria and Putin demonization driving the liberal thirst for World War III now. Then, in 2020, the same was done by a significant portion of the Republican Party and by most of the MAGA base, who argued that the election was stolen by the Democrats. As Marxists know, democracy in liberal capitalist states is limited to the peaceful transfer of power from one faction of the ruling class to another through elections that are largely conditioned by money and the interest of capital. Today, even this superficial appearance of democracy is crumbling. In doing so, we can see here another symptom of the ruling classes not being able to rule in the old way. In essence, by every standard the Marxist tradition uses to assess objectively revolutionary conditions, the US currently meets all of them, and they seem to only be deepening in the coming months and years. However, social revolution demands unity of objective and subjective conditions. As Lenin noted, revolution only arises out of a situation in which the above-mentioned objective changes are accompanied by a subjective change, namely, the ability of the revolutionary class to take mass action strong enough to break the old government, which never, not even in a period of crisis, falls if it is not toppled over. The development of the subjective conditions for revolution is, in essence, synonymous with the development of a successful counter-hegemonic project, that is, with the development of an intellectual and moral vanguard that can win over the masses' minds and hearts to the struggle for socialism. For Gramsci, the starting point of every counter-hegemonic struggle must always be the common sense, which is the spontaneous philosophy of the multitude and which has to be made ideologically coherent by Marxist philosophy. It is a process of being able to figure out and in learning from the masses what are the rational kernels in their common sense that could then be taken and disarticulated from their current incoherent worldviews and rearticulated to socialism where you need them to go. So, for the ideological and emotive rearticulation of the masses' common sense and feelings, what is required from the intellectual leadership or the vanguard party, if you wish, is a dialectical and referential relationship with the masses. In order to successfully educate the masses, the vanguard must be grounded in them. They must learn from the masses and know them concretely. Its relationship with the masses must be active and reciprocal, such that every teacher is always a pupil and every pupil a teacher. The educator, as the young Marx had noted, must himself be educated. This fundamental grounding in the working class is absent in the socialist left of the US. There exists a profound gulf between the working class and socialist organizations, and what often comes to dominate in the latter is what Gus Hall called petty bourgeois radicalism, a mode of political practice and thinking which reflects the interests of the petty bourgeoisie and especially today, what Barbara and John Ehrenreich called the professional managerial class, PMC from now on. We may refer to these class positions under the broader term of middle class. Nonetheless, what is important to note is that the class composition of the left in the US has been dominated by this class, and this is a relatively new phenomenon. As Barbara and John argued in the late 70s, this middle class left, unlike its equivalent in early 20th century Europe or in the third world today, is not a minority within a working class or peasant movement. It is to a very large extent the left itself. Although it is perfectly fine to include professionals, managers, and part of the petty bourgeoisie in the struggle for socialism, the base of any socialist organization must be the working masses, and not these other classes which, although hurt by state monopoly capital, bring with them class biases, some which are antagonistic to the working class, into the workers' movement. Marx had already warned about the negative influence of professionals that professionals could bring into the labor movement and held that the precondition for them entering and being allowed within socialist organizations is that they should not bring with them the least amount of remnant of bourgeois, petty bourgeois, etc. forms of prejudices and should unreservedly adopt a working class outlook. It is impossible for these conditions to be met as the left stands today, where the PMC segment of the middle class is the most dominant and is composed of, as Ehrenreich argues, of salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and class relations. This class functions and develops its political culture through what has been called the iron triangle institutions of academia, the media, and NGOs. Its engagement with the working class often leave the latter feeling as if they've been approached by human resources. The HR atmosphere estranges and repels workers while providing a warm home for more PMC individuals. This creates positive feedback loops that proliferate the influence of the PMC in socialist organizations. As my colleague Noah Krashevik has argued, it does not matter how nice or just the petty bourgeois radicals' ideas sound. It does not matter how many petty bourgeois radicals cancel the working class for not living up to their fantasy, or try to bully it into silence or subjugation to the lofty places the professionals and petty bourgeois occupy within their own minds. If the class interests of the working class are not being fulfilled, and more, if the working class did not see and understand that its interests are being fulfilled, then there will be no revolutionary motion or movement. There will be stagnation at best and reaction at worst. However, the dominance of the PMC within socialist organizing in the US is not a spontaneous phenomenon. It is grounded on a century of state sanctioned anti communist attacks, which have purged communists from trade unions and infiltrated socialist organizations to promote factionalism and forms of socialism, which are compatible with the existing order. The work of Gabriel Rockhill on the global theory industry shows how, through groups like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the works of classical authors from the Western Marxist tradition were propped up by a political economy of knowledge that was and is backed by Western capitalist state departments and intelligence agencies, as well as major capitalist foundations like Rockefeller, Ford, and others, who benefit from the dissemination of a compatible anti-communist Marxism that, although critical of capitalism, denounces every socialist experiment seen around the world and justifies the wars of empire from the left when it needs to. These are the objective forces grounding the purity fetish of Western Marxism. It is not only the only Marxism which is acceptable within the American Academy and civil society, but it has itself become an indispensable component for the defense of the existing order. Many of the individual radical recuperators do this, as Marx highlighted with the commodity fetish, without being aware of it. It is likely that most generally consider their ideas and practices to be revolutionary. That does not change, however, the objective role they play for counter-revolutionary politics. After all, honest opportunism, as Engels highlighted, is perhaps the most dangerous of all. Excuse me. Their objective counter-revolutionary position is a natural result of the fact that if they generally consider, as they do, communism to be as evil as fascism, then bourgeois democracy is, like the world Leibniz's God created, the best of all possible worlds. This makes it the ideal form of controlled opposition, an opposition that buys fully into Thatcher's Tina. There's no alternative. And hence, will never substantially oppose the existing order, for it considers the alternative far worse. From a Gramscian perspective, this shows how controlled forms of counter-hegemony have become necessary to sustain the hegemony of the existing order, and how the dominant institutions have been able to get ahead of the discontent capitalism creates by diverting dissenters into organizations and pathways of critique which do not substantially threaten capitalist imperialism. This position is pervasive in the Bernie Sanders and Democratic Socialist movement, which composes the largest chunk of socialist organizing in the US. For instance, in the 2019 Socialism Conference, hosted by the Democratic Socialists of America, Jacobin, Haymarket Books, socialist countries like China, Cuba, and Venezuela and Nicaragua were condemned as authoritarian. The following week, a report from Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal would show that some of the hosted panelists had received large sums of money from various imperialist organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, an arm the CIA created to do its in the open, what the CIA used to do clandestinely. This raises an interesting paradox I have previously explored. How can anyone be a socialist if they genuinely think each time a socialist or a communist party has been in power, it has resulted in great failures? What sort of arrogance is required to claim that everyone in the third world has failed at socialism, but we, the virtuous West, we're the ones that will succeed? This purity fetish position concerning socialist states is not only verifiably false, but revolutionarily futile. Why would the working class follow something that has always failed? Especially since the working class under discussion has been generationally breastfed anti-communist propaganda. When workers ask the purity fetish Marxist, why would I organize for socialism if the media, schools, and my family have always told me that it leads to poverty, genocide, and societal failure? What can the response of these socialists be? Considering they themselves accept the same dishonest propaganda the workers have been force fed to believe, it would look something like, yes, yes, that is all true. The problem is that those things in the real world called socialism were never actually socialism. Socialism is really this beautiful idea that exists in its pure form in my head. To accept struggling for socialism after that, the worker under discussion would have to be as infantile and simple minded as the socialist he speaks to. Instead of this, socialists and communists should be using the immense successes achieved by socialism in the Soviet Union, in China, Cuba, Bolivia, etc., as examples of what socialism can achieve, even while under the boot of constant hybrid warfare from the global imperialist system. We must be able to show our working classes what socialism has provided for them and what it can provide for us. Before this can be achieved, the left must be able to remove the dogmatic blinders which have given it a narrow, imperialist friendly view of socialist and anti imperialist states. They must be able to engage in a concrete study of past and present socialist experiments to learn from their successes and to understand their mistakes within their proper context, not in an abstract and ahistorical manner. In the context of the US, the purity fetish also manifests itself in the assessment of which parts of the working class are pure enough to organize and which must be left alone in fear of contamination. If a large chunk of the working class is socially conservative and henceforth fails to meet all the purity markers the enlightened PMC left has set as the a priori conditions for approval, they will be rejected as, in the words of Comrade Hillary Clinton, a basket of deplorables, or worse, as fascists, incapable of being brought to the socialist movement. For these Marxists, the traditional communist slogan is no longer workers and oppressed people of the world unite. It is socially enlightened workers and oppressed people of the world unite. These Marxists don't see in the millions of working class Americans who voted for Trump a group of people deceived by Trump's shallow and fake anti establishment discourse. They don't see that what is implicit in that vote is a desire for something new, something which only the socialist movement, not Trump or any bourgeois party, could provide. Instead, they see in this large chunk of the working class a bunch of races bringing forth a fascist threat which can only be defeated by giving up on the class struggle and tailing the Democrats. Silly as it may sound, this policy dominates the contemporary communist movement in the US. The purity fetish preeminent in Western Marxism forgets that, as Lenin once said, one can and must begin to build socialism not with abstract human material or with human material specially prepared by us, but with the human material bequeathed to us by capitalism. Communists cannot pop into existence a pure working class from the void. They must learn how to organize all workers irrespective of the differences the ruling class foists on the working masses to divide them. Communists must understand that the backwardness of the working class that the working class may have will not be overcome if one ignores them. This will only lead them into the hands of the fascists, who are always a contending force in capitalism's moments of crisis. Instead, it must be acknowledged that only through class struggle can the most backward elements of the working class evolve. This does not mean that you tail behind them, but that you understand that because of their class position, they are objectively revolutionary, and therefore that their consciousness and emotions can always be elevated and rearticulated towards socialism. If communists do not have the confidence in their ability to convince workers who don't already agree with them to struggle for socialism, how can they consider themselves communists? What are they doing besides preaching to the choir? As Lenin eloquently noted, it would be an egregious folly to fear this reactionism or try to evade or leap over it, for it would mean fearing that function of the proletarian vanguard, which consists in training, educating, enlightening, and drawing into the new life the most backward strata of the masses and the working class and peasantry. On the other hand, it would be a still graver error to postpone the achievement of the dictatorship of the working class until a time when there will not be a single worker with a narrow craft outlook or with craft and craft union prejudices. The task devolving on communists is to convince the backward elements to work among them and not to fence themselves off with artificial and childishly left slogans. The purity fetish Marxists, however, do not see the world statically and through an essentialist and idealist framework. They do not understand the struggle for socialism as a material process. To them, the forces that exist currently will always remain where and as they are. This outlook is fundamentally antagonistic with the task bequeathed to communists by history, namely to develop the subjective conditions for revolution. However, this outlook is not eternal. It too is subject to change and can be overcome through the development of the dialectical materialist worldview. When one consistently applies in their revolutionary practice the understanding that the world is dominated by change and interconnection, and that if we study the world concretely, we may begin to decipher the forms and structures through which the change and interconnection take place, the anti-dialectical essence of the purity fetish can be overcome. So that's what I wanted to read. It's basically the first half of the last chapter that I have looking at specifically the US, the conditions that we have and how fertile they are for a substantive revolutionary movement, and the crisis that we have in the subjective factor. So, in the sphere of building socialist organizations and how it is that we think about the worldviews that dominate a lot of organizers' approach to the world. And there I mentioned two, one of which is the traditional Western Marxist one, the rejection of actually existing socialism because of its impurities. The other one, which of course is the rejection of a large segment of the specifically Trump part of the working class because they're too impure to organize, which as someone who's been organizing their whole life in the Midwest, surrounded by Trump workers, that's not true. But even if it was, you still have to organize workers regardless of where they start at. We organize on the basis of class, not ideological positions. But The last one I didn't want to read because it was the one that I delved into the most. Because I think in many ways it's one of the most tragic ones because you see it in the communist movement and in various parties that claim to adhere to Marxism, Leninism, and the organizers that are within these parties. So I just want to say a couple things just off the cuff about that last form, and it's the way we read our national past. There's a good number of Marxist organizers or self-proclaimed Marxist organizers that they describe socialism almost synonymously with abolishing America. And you see these statements put out on Twitter and social media platforms, and um, you see these pictures that they put, and these bombastic and ultra-left statements do nothing but separate us from the working class, and um, these folks end up with a very one-sided and what's often called in the Marxist tradition metaphysical view of the US. The US is a social totality like any other that has been in a constant state of change since its inception, and that, like everything else in the world, is riddled with internal contradictions. The same country that has produced the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of African peoples and the subjugation of women and general exploitation and imperialism is the same country that has produced struggles against that. It's the same country that produced Frederick Douglasses and that produced Thomas Paines and that produced people like W.B. Du Bois and Henry Winston and Martin Luther King Jr. and a host of other, a plethora of other people and organizations that have fought against slavery, that have fought against imperialism, that have fought for socialism, for workers' rights, for women's rights, and for the rights of working and oppressed peoples. That's also U.S. history. In many ways, I would consider it more central to U.S. history than all of the bad stuff because the movement forward that we've had in this country has been led by these progressive forces. And if we approach working class people with the same dogma that McCarthyism has fed to them, which is that you have socialism here, you have America here, and there's this unbridgeable gulf in the middle, we're not going to bring anyone to the socialist movement. All we're doing is getting the gun that McCarthyism pointed at us and taking it away from their hand and pointing it at ourselves. Um, there's nothing essentially anti-socialist or anti-communist about the American people and their history. Just like there isn't anything essentially anti-communist about the Russian history, which was also considered for a time the prison house of nations. It was a horrific empire. The practices within it were horrific. So when these Marxists look at U.S. history in that form, they're getting it wrong because they're not seeing the whole picture. They're seeing it in a very one-sided form, and because U.S. fails to meet to it fails to reach their pure idea of what a national past should be. They just reject their national past as a whole, frame socialism as the abolition of America, and participate in what one of the most important 20th century communist theorists, Georgy Dimitrov, called national nihilism, the wholesale rejection of your national past. And it's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake because socialism can only ever be socialism in the concrete. There's no such thing as socialism in the abstract. It always has to take the specific characteristics of the people that have fought and won the struggle for political power. And in China, they call their socialism socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Venezuela, it's called Bolivarian socialism. In the various struggles in Africa, they've called it Pan-African socialism. In Cuba, it means drawing back on Jose Marti and seeing the role that he plays as an apostle of the revolution. In every instance, socialism has always been a universal that has had to concretize itself in the particular. So, in philosophical jargon, um, there's no such thing as an abstract universal. This way that Western philosophy has thought about universals, which I mentioned, I trace it back to Parmenides and the Eleatics, where that which is universal, that which is true, is that which exists in the same way, regardless of space and time, regardless of context. Nothing exists in that form. It's an empty idea of a universal. And the dialectical tradition, whether it's in Hegel or in Marxism, has always argued that universals are always concrete. What makes something universal, it's not the fact that it's not a particular, but the fact that it's able to reappear in various particulars and various particular forms, take different forms. So socialism is no different. Socialism is this universal that has to concretize itself in the particular. And for us in the US, it means that our socialism is not going to look like the Soviet Union's. It's not going to look like China's. It's going to look like something relatively unique to our own history. And when we take this ultra left approach of thinking about socialism as abolish America or whatever, we're being theoretically wrong about our past. We're disconnecting ourselves from our masses, so we're being revolutionary futile. And we're condemning ourselves to not being able to capture the rational, progressive kernel from our country's history, the history of Du Bois and King and, Reconstruction and that progressive history, we're unable to capture it and use it as the historical legs for our movement forward. We're unable to show our people, like, yeah, we have a history of struggle, a very rich one in our country. Some of the biggest minds and most notable figures of our country's history have been socialists. Um, so
Can
in every
can you
case,
close out soon so we
yeah,
can go to some
that's
questions? That was the great presentation. So
thank you. And I'm sorry for going long, but just the last point, in every case, the purity fetish is not just a matter of having a wrong outlook that forces you to a position where you're misunderstanding the world. Yes, we're misunderstanding the world, but in misunderstanding it, we're also condemning ourselves to not transforming it, to not changing the world. It's not a coincidence that the Marxists from this part of the world that have condemned every single socialist experiment because it's too impure, because they're too impure, have been the same ones that have not been able to, even under the best objectively revolutionary circumstances, to produce their own revolution. So it's not just a matter of theory and getting things right for the sake of getting them right. That's important, but it's also the fact that it affects our practice, and we'd be much better off in our struggles if we eliminated the purity fetish.
so I'd like to thank Carlos and for this great presentation. And I'm sure we have people who, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, raise your hand and I'll call on you. And if I don't see a hand go up soon, I'm going to start with the first comment, but I'll give a chance. Okay, Joan, do you want to go? And one more thing. Let's not ramble on too long with our if it's a comment, and if it's a question, if we can get through them, state the question a little quicker, that'd be great, so we don't have to so a number of people can ask questions and make comments. Thanks. Go ahead, Joan.
Yeah. When I saw what Greg had announced, I was interested in differences on the left, which somebody had written in the chat. Ukraine war was one of the places where the left, the Green Party left, has differences. And your presentation seemed to be between something that you're calling a purity fetish, which I didn't feel was defined, except I gathered must have to do with a view of socialism and some other view of socialism. Is that what you're presenting? Is just as though the left were all socialist and some people wanted some purity part of socialism and some people wanted some other part of socialism that's not pure, but it's all socialism?
Thank you for your question. The purity fetish is simply a way of approaching the world where if things don't measure up to your pure ideals in the head, they're rejected. So it takes a variety of different forms, and it in every way prohibits us from successfully struggling in some of the forms I enumerated in the presentation. But
But
yes,
that's
one
what,
of the
Carlos, my question is, are you presenting the differences of the left as simply the differences between two parts of the socialists? Like the
two
left
ways.
is all socialists, and then there's some parts of the socialists who are purity fetishes and some parts of the socialists who aren't?
Yeah. In essence, well, I consider that the purity fetish outlook is is quite predominant in the U.S. left. I've found
But
that
what
in
I'm
various.
saying is, Carlos, what I'm trying to say is, are you acting as though the entire left is socialist, just different types?
No, I'm speaking about specifically democratic socialist spaces, communist spaces. So,
All
um,
socialists, communists, as though there was no left that's not either socialist or communist? That's my question.
I'm
Yeah,
speaking
John.
specifically to crisis in my tradition. I'm a Marxist, and it's a book primarily directed towards Marxists. So I'm thinking of organizations like the PSL, the CPUSA, the PCUSA, the DSA. I haven't interacted much with the Green Party, but those are the organizations that I have in mind, and the flaws of the organizers that I have in mind.
John, I muted you just so you could give him and quit interrupting. I think he's answered the question. I'm going to go on to the next question. Steve, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm unmuted. I want to sort of introduce another impurity into what you're talking about, and that is the idea of racial struggle in the United States is very often waved aside as being simply a divide and conquer strategy, a divide and rule strategy. But if you look at the history of it in the United States, you find that the conquering came first, and then the division as a result. So that when you look at the way in which the relationship between Black communities and, let's say, white supremacist organizations and cultures interact, they interact on a class basis. And the white have working class, middle class, have acted and actually succeeded in a large degree of proletarianization of Black people and Black workers. Now, we have that coming up now with people like Kaliakuno speaking about the possibility of a civil war if somebody like Trump, for instance, like runs in the next election and so forth and so on. And what he is doing is calling a question on both sides of this divide, which stands outside the class struggle that it has, and so far has been described by Marxism. And like we had E.B. Du Bois saying, what do we got? We have workers on one side and workers on the other side. They have the same interests, and yet they're fighting continually. We have somebody like George Jackson, who theorizes that the Black communities in the United States are colonialized. They're colonies, and therefore would have to fight a different kind of ideology, a liberation ideology, rather than a class struggle to seize political power ideology. Now, how does that fit into the I get a sense of unitarity of Marxism, and I really enjoyed your talk and the fluidity that you bring into your conceptualizations. But I think that there's still a unitarity hiding in there. How would you integrate this situation that I'm describing, which is at the core of all of U.S. history, as you yourself say, into what you are projecting for Marxism?
Thank you so much, Steve. That's a very insightful question, and I actually have a paper that is coming out on the Journal of Labor and Society on that question specifically. One of my main areas of research study is Du Bois and quite a few of the directors at the Institute consider Du Bois to be in many ways the founder of American Marxism for a couple of reasons, which uh, you're raising in terms of the problem at play. There has been a historical section of Marxists, self-proclaimed Marxists, who have described the struggle against racism or the struggle, women's struggles against patriarchy or national liberation struggles as other struggles, as non-class struggles, and have considered that focusing on those is taking the attention away from class. Um, I disagree with that, and I think that the Marxist classics disagree. If you look at how Frederick Engels describes the first form of class struggle in history, he described it as the struggle against patriarchy. You know, that's an anti-sexist struggle. If you look at how Marx and Lenin described the struggles of the Poles or various national struggles, they describe them as class struggles. Um, if you look in the writings of Marx and Engels on the American Civil War, or in the writings of Du Bois on the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction, it's absurd to think that the emancipation of 4 million Black proletarians in the U.S. South is some form not a class, is in some way not a class struggle, but just trade unionism in the North is. You know, class struggle, the same way that socialism in general doesn't exist, class struggle in general doesn't exist. It always takes specific forms, right? And sometimes the struggle against racism has been the form the class struggle has taken. Sometimes it's taken the form of a national liberation struggle. It's taken various forms, and you're absolutely right that in the US, the centerpiece of our class struggles have usually been these struggles against racism, which produced the Civil War and Reconstruction, which for a small period of time, if we agree with Du Bois, we had in various states in the South what he called the dictatorship of labor. He compared it to the Soviet Union and the Paris Commune. So that we don't talk about that today, but that lasted for around a decade and came well before the Paris Commune. But every year we do something on the Paris Commune, but not on Reconstruction. If we basically had, you know, semi-socialist worker states in the South that were led by Freemen's Association and backed up by the power of the national government. Then we have what I call the Third American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement in 1964. Incredibly transformative political revolution.
Which indeed could be considered a class struggle and a general strike of its own.
Absolutely,
And,
absolutely.
And to incorporate that kind of idea that the civil rights era was a general strike would change everybody's, like concept of class.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that a big problem of the left is usually the undermining of these. They have what some scholars have called a white blind spot. They can only see class struggle when it's white workers fighting, and then when it's other workers from different backgrounds fighting, they call it a struggle of whatever identity they're from. But no, those are class struggles, and the civil rights movement was a successful class struggle that brought about a political revolution in the U.S. It completely eliminated or illegally eliminated this underclass. It's taken time for things to change, but because of that tradition, I'm hesitant to say that today it is still the case that the main thing dividing workers in the U.S. is racism. Because I think maybe I'm overly optimistic that the civil rights movement changed things quite a bit. And it doesn't mean that racist institutions and racist people aren't still around. Of course they are. But in general,
we had the biggest demonstrations in a long time in 2020 around the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Yeah.
That's exactly what, that couldn't have happened. And I mean, they killed King and we didn't see those numbers. We saw 25 to 35 million people and they felt like I went to a lot of these demonstrations in small towns in the Midwest. What I didn't see, the feeling of they just killed another black man. What I saw was they killed one of us. And that has never occurred in US history, where white young people and young people from various backgrounds went out and not just young people, everyone from various backgrounds, they felt like they killed one of us. The literal slogan, which wasn't just George Floyd, it comes from before Mike Brown, "I can't breathe." That was the slogan. The I was almost symbolic for the fact that they killed one of us. So what this means is that if in our history, one of the major things that has prevented working class unity is racism, today, yes, racism is still here, but we can't just say that we're losing the struggle for socialism because of racism. You can go to the most racist parts of the country, and yes, white workers will probably still have prejudices about their black coworkers, but I highly doubt I cannot even envision a world in which they would say, no, I do not want to fight with my black coworker in order to advance our common economic demands because they're black. So I think that this means that the biggest thing that has prevented the struggle for socialism in the US, which has been this racism that's been proliferated by the ruling class. It's not done, but it's been largely overcome in some areas of the white working class.
I would just add one thing.
Make it quick,
That's
Steve, please.
And the police kill on the average 1,000 people a year throughout the United States. And they are becoming the bastion of white racism now, not in its own terms, but in the terms of being a police force that is going to make certain kinds of people safe from crime. And that has to be integrated into any kind of description of a class struggle and a class structure in the United States now, and that's just come to be in the last 10 years.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Can I say something real quick?
You say something real quick, and then we're going to go to the next speaker. But go ahead, real quick, Carlos.
That is definitely true, and there are a lot of. It's a profession, the armed bodies of men, as Lenin called it, that draws a lot of white supremacists. But if you look statistically, the areas where black people are disproportionately killed are the areas where there's a disproportionate amount of black poverty in the black community. There's some areas of the U.S. South, Tennessee, and I want to say either Mississippi or Alabama, and this is something that Christian Parenti recently wrote about, where disproportionate poverty is actually on the white working class, and disproportionate police violence falls on them. So when you look at it from an empirical standpoint, they're killing all of us because we're poor. So the media doesn't talk about this, because what happens if we saw 35 million people hit the street because they killed one of us, a black man, but if they show how they kill all of us because we're poor, because the police is an armed body of the capitalist state, that's an incredible ground for working class unity against a state that, yes, is racist, but it also hates all of us because we're poor and we threaten their property.
Okay, let's leave it at that.
Yeah. Swaha, you want to ask your question?
Yes, hello. This is Ariane Eroy calling from San Francisco. Thank you for that last explanation, Doctor. Just because that made attending this talk worthwhile for me. I had hoped that this talk would be very personal and practical, because I think that's what we need. We're in a state of crisis, considering the urgency and the importance of the issues that beset us in almost every realm of society. And so I hope that in the future you'll consider that as well. And I know how difficult it is to think about how to bring people together when they agree or when they disagree, or when they believe or assume that they disagree, but may not, but that their forces using divide and conquer and prevent us from starting with seeing we have shared values. I have a question, which is a question that I would like to pose in general in these, these rooms, and also I wish in public radio, is that I'm wondering what your vision of a new future would be for America. You said that you had a sense that socialism in America, if it were to be successful, would have a distinctive way of being. And I'm wondering if you have a thought about what that might look like, because if we do have a vision, I think we're much more likely to be able to be both inspired but also to work towards that vision, and it's practical to have some vision. So this is what I would ask.
Carlos, you have to unmute.
Sorry, but thank you for the question, and I agree on the importance to stay practical. And um, you know, part of my work for the Midwestern Marx Institute is presenting a lot of these ideas and other ideas in a simpler form. This is a book, so it's a little bit more complicated. I use technical language, and it's got a specific audience of people that are within the orbit of the work that I do as a communist. Uh, but you're right. I do think that there's practical importance in thinking about and critiquing the purity fetish. But in terms of talking about it, I usually do it differently in different contexts. This time I decided to read from the book, though. As far as your other question of what socialism would look like, I'm not sure. I don't think those are questions we can really answer. I know that on the basis of what we have now, it's very clear that take healthcare. Like, it's incredibly inefficient. We waste so much money and get results that are, subpar, very mediocre. We all know the statistics of how many people die because they're underinsured or uninsured, and it's just completely absurd. And something like the nationalization of healthcare, so that it actually is centered on meeting people's needs and not profit, would be a must. I agree that the vast majority of really central industries for an economy need to be put in a state's hands, not this current state's hands. That's the hands of the capitalist state, but a working class state would get all of these central industries, put them under their command, make them serve not the interests of the profits of a small few in society, but the interests of the people at large. Do so in a way that promotes both economic growth, so that our cities are not collapsing and deteriorating quicker than we can blink, but that does so in an environmentally sustainable fashion. We have an aura of admiring, like, small businesses and family-owned businesses that is not usually found in other countries. I can't imagine an American socialism that doesn't, like, have the state stimulate small businesses. When I go to small farms and small businesses in the rural Midwest, I'm not thinking, oh my God, look at these exploitative bosses. I'm thinking, wow, this is a community atmosphere where in many ways the forms of interaction are very different from what you find in these massive cosmopolitan centers where um, there's no real social bonds between people. Um, so yeah, I don't think we can nicely define it, but uh, it's going to organically define itself as the movement develops. And I think things like nationalizing key industries and leaving a role for, like, small businesses and worker co-ops and all that sort of stuff would at the level of economics seem to be somewhat both in line with previous socialist experiments, but in many ways also unique to our history and conditions.
Laura, you want to go next?
Yes. So my question has to do with you were talking about China with socialism with Chinese characteristics, Cuban characteristics, Venezuelan characteristics. I went to Nicaragua a few years ago. Would you also include Nicaragua in that, and or do you have any comments about Nicaragua?
Yeah, I would include every country that has successfully had a working class or socialist party obtain power. So definitely Nicaragua's in there, and yeah, like the role that Catholicism plays in their socialism. They're deeply rooted in liberation theology and in a form of revolutionary Christianity that is rooted in the Church of the Poor. Um, And that's a common characteristics of other forms of Latin American socialism. But yeah, it's definitely rooted in, and it can't not be, they can't somehow copy paste what was done like in Russia or something and apply it to Nicaragua or to any other place in the world. So in many ways, it's such a basic common sense idea, but so many in the communist left in the US act as if we can just delete the last 300-400 years and then just boom, here's a textbook of what socialism is, we'll just incorporate it all fully. It doesn't work like that. So thank you.
Michael K., you want to ask your question? You have to unmute.
Yes, I am unmuted and now you can see me, although I don't look very pretty. But it's nice to see all of you. Some of you I know and haven't seen in a while. I asked a question in the chat, Carlos, and maybe you saw it, about the difference and the relationship between what you call a purity fetish and the primary contradiction. And I'm not really sure how a purity fetish is different than just sectarianism, which I certainly have experienced in my 70 years of being a socialist or 60 years of being a Marxist-Leninist. In the chat, I asked a question about the split in the peace movement over Ukraine, and I'm wondering whether you can comment on my question. I made a mistake in the chat and said the primary condition, but I meant the primary contradiction. But I'll leave it to you. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you so much, Michael. And yeah, the way that I would see the relationship of the purity fetish to sectarianism is that the purity fetish as an outlook, as the collective ideas that shape how we engage with the world, is what produces in many ways sectarianism, at least the ideological level. So you're absolutely right to see the connection there. And in many ways, it's the very deep sectarianism that I have found in the left in my last decade or so of activism and organizing that let me created the conditions for me to be able to reflect, and along with others in the institute develop the concept of the purity fetish. Let me read your question here. How does the concept as far as the notion of principal contradiction, it's an important development, because up to then what we had was just the universality of contradictions, and that those few categories that Mao develops on contradictions are concretizing our understanding of contradiction and the particularity of contradictions. And I would see it related to the critique of the purity fetish, because what the purity fetish is like the positive way of labeling an absence of dialectical materialist thinking. And the concept of principal contradiction is definitely a very essential one in the tradition of materialist dialectics. Let me see what the other part of your question is.
I think it was about Ukraine. I think, like, is this, what's that role playing in this split in the left on Ukraine?
Well, in my view, at least, I'm for peace, but I also don't consider it to be the case that the working class doesn't have a side in this affair. From my interactions with communists in Russia and in Ukraine, a lot of which had to flee because of the fascist persecution of progressive and socialist forces to Russia. The working class has a side in this war. It's a war that the progressive forces in Russia see as a fight against fascism, an existential fight against fascism. And in terms of geopolitics, look at what it's doing to US NATO imperialist hegemony. How many countries have reacted against the US following the sanctions regimes and the freezing of Russian money in Western banks? So it's definitely at the micro level, I see it as a war against fascism. At the level of geopolitics, I see it as a glaring defeat in a U.S. proxy war against a Russia that, for a very long time was considered part of the Second World because of the Soviet Union, and then the fall of the fall/overthrow of the Soviet Union, because we have that 91 referendum where the vast majority of Soviet people vote to stay in the revolutionary process, and that gets overturned. But the 90s were just horrific. Were completely horrific, and it was what some scholars have called the third worldization of Russia. I mean, if you look at the conditions and the poverty and prostitution and crime and everything else that occurred in the 90s, it's just horrible. And in many ways, I agree with scholars like Domenico Losordo, and a few other scholars from the global south that consider Russia to be part of the global south. And I see this in many ways as the global south fighting back against empire and winning, frankly.
Nancy, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. Actually wanted to add a little bit of perspective in terms of a context within which I've been observing we're looking at the possibility of life now and in the future here on the earth, and how the role that peoples here in this land, the effect we've been having on the overall earth. And I was seeing how for thousands of years here, the peoples who were living here lived a traditional life that did not include the use of alcohol. And in that time, there was actually a paradise here, an abundance and diversity, clean water, clean air, clean, fertile soil. And then a few hundred years, and this was literally thousands of years, not just even a couple thousand. I mean, they've been documenting. You can research that if you like. But within just a few hundred years, the alcohol culture that came across the water, and it has certain assumptions such as that we can do whatever we like and no one can call us on it, there's no consequences for our actions. So this alcoholic bully culture has moved across the land, killed the Indians, brought the slaves, treated children and women and most men as non-entities. But then just within a few hundred years, that balance of nature has been tipped by the values that came out of this alcoholic bully culture, and that the whole world admires, I mean, except for the people who are suffering from it. But the other ones just want to emulate it. And it's tipped the balance of nature where there may not be future generations to even be considering which socialism or not we might like to have. And that the plants, animals, and children have no voice even now. And so I'm not necessarily proposing any particular thing. I would just like to introduce it into the context that we're looking at life right now and thinking about the future, thinking about the present, and thinking about how are we going to deal with this? Because generally you don't think about this, but it's operating. I mean, the Congress makes its decisions. Nuclear power decides where to put the nuclear waste over lunches, alcoholic lunches. I mean, this is something that we don't look at, and we're not aware of how much the alcoholic bully culture is running everybody's life and deciding our future. And the balance of nature has been tipped. The Hopi prophecy has described it very well, and the weather tells us. So I just wanted to introduce it. We can think about it. I don't know what we're going to do, but I'd like it to be included if we're thinking about caring about people and other forms of life. Thanks.
I didn't hear a question there. I don't know, Carlos, if you want to say anything, but I think we can go to the next, see if we get a question. So Dave, you want to ask a question? Make a comment, short comment. And by the way, we're going to go at least till 1:45, if that's okay with Carlos. And let's get if you can send have your questions be a little short and not too long, then we'll get through the rest of the stack.
I want to unmute.
You're unmuted, Dave.
Oh, okay. You can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. your screen is freezing, so you might want to turn off your video and just ask, make your comment or make a question. You seem to have frozen, Dave. I'm going to skip over you and go to Anne. Anne, are you there? Let's go to
Yeah,
Anne.
seems to be automatically shifting between mute and unmute.
Dave, can you hold off? Let's while
Can't
you're
tell if anyone can hear me.
Okay, Dave, we
Turn
can't
off.
hear you. Turn off your audio. Turn off your video, Dave. There you go. Now try your question.
Let's see.
We can hear you.
Me?
Just ask. Yes,
Okay,
Dave,
is
ask
that
your
Can
question.
you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Dave. Ask your question.
Okay, yeah.
Dave, are you going to ask your question?
Oh, okay. Yeah, for Carlos. Yeah, you had a lot of things I thought were excellent, but one thing is, yeah. Okay, Carlos. Yeah, you had mentioned that one of the things you see in the MAGA people and the pro-Trump movement is at the bottom of it, there's this huge amount of dissatisfaction. And in other contexts, you might think of that as a very Marxist, anti-capitalist kind of feeling, sentiment building, but it's all kind of turned towards blaming liberals and blaming foreigners coming across the border, and everybody except the who Marxists ordinarily would blame. Do you see any practical way of shifting that toward putting the blame more where it might be productive? Any practical comments?
Thank you so much for the question, Dave. That's a great question. The first thing I'd say is that we need to see the potential in them. That's part of what the parts of the left don't do. They cross them out as essentially being bigots and racists. And I live amongst a lot of these folks, and they're not. They support Trump in spite of the the bigotry and those comments. And what really draws a lot of them to Trump is that he feels like an outsider in a political scene where they know they haven't been represented for a very long time. And they know that their lives are a hell of a lot worse than their grandparents or their parents' lives were. Um, as an organizer, I worked with the Bernie campaign in 2020. Um, and I want to say that anywhere from 70 to 80% of the people that were on my team were former Trump voters from working class and farmer backgrounds in Iowa, Dubuque, Iowa, who converted. Because as soon as they're already thinking about fake news, criticizing the news, criticizing big pharma or the deep state, it's a hop and a skip away from getting them to see how it's an economic system, a mode of life. And so at the practical level, one of the things that I succeeded at specifically with the notion of fake news is, well, extend that critical lens to Fox News and the news coming from the right. And then don't just look at the news, look at history books, look at other forms of achieving your consent for the existing order, and think a little bit more critically about who are the people that you're supposed to always hate. The communists. That's the people that have been essentially demonized the most in the last 120 years of our country's history. So if they specifically are attuned to the attacks that like Trump has faced from the security state or something, use that as a point of connection. And it's always, I mentioned this in the presentation, and maybe it wasn't clear, but you always have to find a common point, what I call a rational kernel, that you can then use from that basis to take them to somewhere else. And I find it very easy finding those rational kernels with Trump people, working class people. There's obviously, a big chunk of the elite that's with Trump. So for anyone that's a teacher, like how do you teach people who've never engaged with the material before? You go to a point of connection, something that they're familiar with, and you try to take them from what they already kind of know to where to the new thing you're trying to teach them. You can't just give them information that they can't even make sense of. You have to, and that means that we can't be lazy and have like a one size fits all approach. We have to always study the concrete concretely, as Lenin was fond of saying.
And yes, you're next.
Yeah, I've been reading Anya Parmpill's new book about Venezuela. And one thing I appreciated about it was that she explained that most of the economy was private. And what socialism means there most fundamentally is that the country's natural resources belong to the people and should be, and the people should profit from them. I don't know, that might not be the right word, but should benefit from them. I wondered if you could just say anything on that.
Yeah, at the most general level, that's what socialism is. It's a society that works for society itself, and where the people that produce, that literally create all the things that are around us and that we engage with, are as a class the ones who control both those things at the economic level, but that control everything else. Governance and the term that's used in classical Marxist jargon for the first few stages of socialism is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's got that very scary word, dictatorship, in it. But in reality, if you think of the concept of democracy, demos, that means common folk, not just people. Its implication was common people. And kratos, power. It means the people are in power. That's what democracy meant. And when you think of the proletariat as the mass of humanity that are forced to work to survive, and you think of the dictatorship of who's dictating? Well, the mass of people. And so that concept that's kind of scary of dictatorship of the proletariat used to describe socialism in the Marxist tradition. It's really just democracy. What democracy actually means. It's common people, working class people, being the ones in charge of their destiny in every level, at the level of economics, politics, ideology, schools, everything else. That's what the Venezuelans have done. They haven't been able to finish it. There's still a lot of private control over central resources, but in terms of the government, it's not fully a working class government yet. It's a working class party in power in a state that still has a lot of the institutions from before the conquest of political power by Hugo Chavez and PSOV, but it's definitely moving in the right direction and fighting tremendous pressure from the US and its national capitalist and reactionary forces. Thank you for the
Carlos, I'm going to reserve for myself the last question. And you talked about the inability of the elite to rule in the old way. And but sometimes that means they figure out another way to rule. So the capitalists seem to be pretty damn flexible, and when a contradiction appears, they figure out what to do. So, like at the end of World War II, the military-industrial complex kind of was invented to create a labor force that could keep going, and we could keep building, growing, and then the gold crises and so on for the at the end of in the early 70s, we had neoliberalism was kind of ushered in, and during those crises for over debt, and then the national security state that came in a bit later, and I think we have somebody else. We may need to mute. And so we and then you had the current crisis.
James, I can't hear you. After you said current crisis, I think
after the current crisis with which is between COVID and our climate crisis and the massive debt, and I keep looking for like what new magic is going to come along, and there was a paper, or there was a speak by Jake Sullivan that was given back in April on renewing the American economic leadership. So I've been wondering, the current crisis that's, also manifested in our wars that seem to fail. It was an unusual talk, and I'm going to read something from the monthly review. It said Sullivan's talk was unusual and attracted widespread attention for at least three reasons. First, what was announced as a fundamental shift away from Washington consensus associated with neoliberal globalization and its replacement by what Sullivan called the new Washington consensus, organized around a de facto U.S. new Cold War against China. And the purported China threat was used to justify economic sanctions against rival states and government supply side subsidies to corporations and a militarized industrial policy. And second is such a major departure of overall U.S. economic policy was issued not by the president, but by a top economic advisor, which was also somewhat surprising. Normally that's something you hear from a president. And third, it was to justify Washington's new stance laid out as a number of challenges facing, which were economic stagnation, deindustrialization, climate change, growing inequality, and the waning of hegemony, which were all kind of blamed on China, and the key to this doctrine was this notion that there's been this hollowing out of our industrial base, and now we have to too dependence on global economy, and now we're going to make these changes. And so I'm just wondering if you maybe could comment a little on this.
That's a really great question, because the same way that we could be flexible in our struggle, the capitalist is as well. And as you mentioned, it's been very good at reinventing itself anew in times of crisis and ensuring that it survives for a little bit longer. I think that what makes this one different is a mixture of two things. At the international level, so much of our power came from the fact that in this stage of capitalism, imperialism, the real core of economic power is in the control of financial institutions, and behind a lot of that has been dollar hegemony. Especially in the post-war context, and that's quickly, going down the wayside. I've seen statistics from people like Pepe Escobar that it's supposed to go as low as 30% in global trade by 2030. So that affects how successful sanctions can be against other countries, and with the rise of BRICS, which is an ambiguous group. You have socialist developmentalism and also other forms of non-socialist nationalist economies within the global south that are trying to develop and break away from the model of neoliberalism and austerity and impoverishment for the global south. With the rise of this group, this presents in many ways an existential threat to U.S. imperialism, as it hasn't seen in the past. It's a threat that I think it's much worse than anything that the Soviet Union presented for it economically. The power that China has now, it's still a country fighting back against imperialism, but the global position that it's in is a lot better than the one that the Soviet Union was ever in. So the challenge that the American elite faces in that front is a lot more serious. On the other hand, there's a reason why all of the good, productive jobs that kept up at least some nice infrastructure in a country are gone. It wasn't China that came with a gun to all of our capitalists, like, come on, we want you to go back to China and develop our industries. It was capitalism that fled. And we have to look at why was it that capital fled. And if you see the tendencies, and Marx didn't have a magic 8-ball looking at the future, but if you do a concrete study of capitalism, you find that there's a tendency for the rate of profits to fall. And there's a lot of great economists, people like Radhika Desai and Alan Freeman, Michael Hudson, who have shown how by the crisis of the late 1970s, the rate of profit was extremely low. And when you're thinking about reinvestments, as a capitalist, you have two options when you get to that point within your own country where just maintaining the rate of profit is difficult. you either go towards a more form of parasitism, towards a worse form of parasitism, through financialization, and a whole lot of capitalists have gone down the route of financialization. That's a big part of what we've seen in the last 5 decades, since the beginning of neoliberalism, a financialization of the US and many European economies. Or you take whatever productive industries you have where you can find cheap labor, to super exploit. So some of them go to China and other parts of the world, and some of them just focus on financialization. A lot of them do both. So at the level of the American economy, unless there is a whole lot of government intervention, it's, I think, virtually impossible to do something like industrialize. The only way we'll be able to reindustrialize and have a green development, productive project in the US will be, at least in my view, through socialism. You know, the capital is not going to let itself be forced to come back and pay workers a living wage. It won't be able to derive profit, if that's the case. So at the economic level, I think the crisis is much more profound. In many ways, that turn in the 1970s was like an extra life source on American capitalism, and we're seeing that, I'm losing like the medical term for it, but that boost of life, we're seeing that boost itself coming to an end. So it's a real serious. That doesn't mean that we're guaranteed socialism. If we don't fight for it and win, we can get barbarism, as Luxemburg noted. It's either socialism or barbarism. So can the ruling class and the elite be flexible enough to weather the crisis? We'll see. I think the situation that we have now is a little different from previous crises, just because of the factors I've enumerated. But I never doubt the capacity of the capitalists to use all of their seemingly infinite means to fight back and sustain their power.
Well, with that note, I want to thank Carlos for a great talk and a great back and forth with our audience, and we really appreciate it. I was glad my emails didn't just keep going into your spam folder after that first one.
But I started looking at the spam now, thanks to that. So
okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for showing up. This was great. Our Greens Party County Council meeting is going to start in 5 minutes, 6 minutes, maybe a few minutes after that. Anybody's welcome to stay on to that. Carlos, I want to thank you again. This was great, and it was really nice to meet you. And hopefully, we can keep in contact.
Likewise, thank you so much for hosting me, and it was a pleasure talking to all of you, presenting and answering your questions.